In this lecture, we're going to discuss the influence of Louis Armstrong on jazz. We've already seen the importance of the soloist in jazz, going back at least to Buddy Bolden, who, of course, is in the pre-recorded history of jazz. And then we've mentioned important soloistic elements from King Oliver and Sidney Bechet, Johnny Dodds. But really the person who kind of brings it together is a vocabulary of extended melodic devices and harmonic effects. The person who really brings a kind of outgoing character to the jazz soloist and makes that something of his trademark, that would be Louis Armstrong. And so the title here, What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue, is playing on a song written by Andy Razaf and Fats Waller in 1929 that Louis Armstrong recorded several times, and also that wound up being the basis of a movie featuring him that we're going to talk about later today, which is Rhapsody in Black and Blue. Even though that song is not featured, clearly the title is referring to it. So we're going to come back to that issue further on. Before we get started with Louis Armstrong, though, let's talk a little bit about elements of recording history around 1925. Or developing into 1925, to get a better sense of the technological elements behind the recordings of this time. And that requires that we look at the microphone. In 1876, the first microphone is invented as a telephone transmitter by Alexander Graham Bell. Obviously, if you're going to have a telephone, there has to be a microphone. There has to be something that's going to capture the sounds of the voice and send it on. It employed liquid to register sounds, and it's totally impractical because it leaked constantly and it did not produce the sounds as clearly as one would hope. In 1878, David Edward Hughes invented the carbon microphone. Now, in this version, what happens is the voice moves carbon granules that are loosely packed between two metal plates that have electricity running through them, and it transmits sound. Now, this carbon microphone, therefore, has to be plugged in, but it doesn't have to be plugged into an amplifier. It can work just as the microphone. It will amplify the sounds just as the device itself, right? So the microphone I'm using to record this now doesn't work that way. It's not a carbon microphone, obviously, and it has to be hooked into something that actually amplifies it and registers the sounds. But a carbon microphone, strictly speaking, doesn't. So you can use a carbon microphone. They were very often used in the late 19th and early 20th centuries for speeches where you're not plugging it into any kind of sound system. You're not plugging it into any kind of amplifiers. The microphone itself will do the amplification. Here you see the diagram from Bell's patent application, and there you also see one of the early versions of the microphone by Alexander Graham Bell. Here you see some carbon microphones, and you see some from the patent application for that. In fact, you see the section where the witnesses signed it under figure 2 there. And then you see some early carbon microphones. And the first one's a very good example where, actually all three, none of these are designed to plug in to anything. They're just working as a form of... The NBC one must plug in. I just don't see where it would, but you would think it would, since it looks like that's for radio. But that first one in particular is not to be plugged into anything. You just set it in front of you, speak through it, and it'll make your voice louder, kind of in the manner of a megaphone, but without the squawks and without some of the annoying aspects, distortion aspects of the megaphone. Here's Berliner's patent in 1886. Edison and Berliner separately improved the design of the microphone. Remember, Edison and Berliner are in close competition with each other about the radio, and so again, obviously microphones are going to be important for that. So these were used for the radio. They're of limited frequency range, so they're not great for music. So when you get to the very high notes, no one can hear anything. It distorts, and the low notes also distort. But for a speaking voice, speaking in a fairly calm, even tone, they work fairly well. And that's his patent. Then you have the condenser microphone, and this is a big leap forward in 1916. It's developed by E.C. Wendt of Bell Laboratories. It's much better for radio and early sound movies. Remember the sound movies begin in 1927, and when they first begin, they're using condenser microphones. What you have is two parallel plates with each with their own electric charge. So it's not an electric charge being passed between them, a single electric charge, but rather what happens is the waves interfere with each other in various ways to project the sound. Sound vibrations move the front plate, and the back plate is fixed, and the movements change the current flow. It requires an amplifier, unlike the carbon microphone, so it has to be plugged into something. 1921 to 1924, there's stiff competition to improve the fidelity of microphones to provide greater amplification with valve amplifiers among RCA, Western Electric, and Kellogg. And another thing that they're trying to do is improve the register of the microphone so that you can sing high notes and low notes and not get the distortion, so that they have a greater range in that sense as well. By 1925, many recording studios were employing the condenser microphone. So 1925 is really the date I want you to remember, because that's the transition to electrical recordings, where you're no longer just singing directly into a phonograph machine or a gramophone machine in order to etch your voice onto the recordings, but rather you're singing through a microphone that then transmits the sounds to the to that device, to the sensitive diaphragm to etch onto a recording, and then you make the master. And all the things we've talked about before with the Berliner design. In 1931, we have the ribbon microphone. And the ribbon microphone, again, this is a huge leap forward. And the ribbon microphone continues to be employed and continues to be developed over the next several decades, and really right up to today. It has a moving coil, so it's a dynamic microphone by Wendt and A.C. Thurall. Also in 1931, RCA introduces the ribbon microphone. So 1931 was the moving coil or dynamic microphone by Wendt, and then RCA introduces the ribbon microphone that same year, and that becomes typical for voice recording. So whenever you're listening to Frank Sinatra, he was interested in using the ribbon microphone. In fact, as we'll see when we talk about Sinatra, he's part of the development of advances in microphone history. So this is just the first time we're going to be talking about the development of microphones. That's going to be a major part of it, of what we talk about in the development of popular music. Keep in mind that this is an important element here, right? A microphone is an instrument. When you are a singer, especially if you're a singer of popular music, but really any modern singer these days, you have to be aware of the microphone. You are not just singing in a room full of people. You're singing in a way that's being transmitted through a microphone, and you move your mouth in relation to that microphone accordingly. You try to avoid the pops of the P's and the B's, and you try to avoid the things that I don't necessarily avoid that I'm sure you hear in these recordings, like the deep breaths that one takes and so on. All of that you learn how to do in relation to a microphone, to create a smoother and better delivery of the sounds of your voice. So a microphone really is an instrument, and seeing its development over the course of popular music is going to be important to us. The recording studio is also a kind of instrument, right? It's not just a device of convenience. It has a real impact on the sound, or a set of devices. The studio is not one device, but a set of devices. So the advent of electric recording. Electric recording, as I said, this sort of comes into focus around 1925, so that's the date we're going to use. This allowed for the greater projection of greater intimacy in the recordings of the voice, and we talked about this a bit with the style of crooning, or we're going to talk about it. With the style of crooning. There were several important crooners that became superstars, like Bing Crosby, Rudy Vallee, and Russ Columbo. By the 1930s, these crooners had hit radio shows with major sponsors, and the sponsors were like cigarette companies, automobile companies, soap companies, laxative companies, right? And sometimes the shows would be named after them. So you had shows that were named after laundry detergent and so on. Other programs like Make Believe Ballroom, which started in 1932, were also popular and propelled disc jockeys to prominence. And we'll talk about the rise of the disc jockey in an upcoming session. Comedy and drama radio programs also became incredibly popular in the 1920s. Primary examples include the blackface radio program, Amos and Andy, which ran from 1928 all the way to 1955, right? It had its own spin-off television show. It had spin-off movies. It had all sorts of merchandise associated with it. And this was just two white radio performers who played a variety of black characters and a few white characters, but mostly black characters, almost entirely black characters, on this show, right? So obviously they didn't have to actually wear blackface, but they're drawing on a blackface voice, a racially coded voice that they're using, and all these minstrel character archetypes that they're employing, with some of them being more ambitious, but perhaps sort of zip-coonish in the sense that they don't always understand what they're up to, that their plots are foiled in various ways, and then some of them are more of the Jim Coon, the lazier characters. Another big radio show from 1931 to 54 was Lum and Abner, and that plays more on the South, on the white South, stereotypes and so on. And then there was the first soap opera, and it was literally a soap opera. It was designed to promote laundry detergent and soap to housewives who were listening to it during the day while their husbands were at work, and that was Clara, Lou, and Em. And it was a serialized soap opera, meaning that these various characters would get themselves into various romantic entanglements and various problems, and we would leave them in the middle of the problem and then have to tune in next time to see what they do about it, and that would continue on, just like soap operas today. More and more black bands are getting crossover appeal, but the record listings are segregated. So there's race records, hillbilly records, and then the more mainstream records, which are just labeled as records, right, or hit records. We'll come back to these divisions soon. Louis Armstrong, of course, is one of the major innovators in jazz. He's credited with several things, including the following: shifting the focus from collective improvisation, the heterophony of early New Orleans jazz, to solo performance, where there's a featured soloist or a series of soloists, and they get entire choruses to improvise and elaborate the melody or do whatever they want. He's also credited with having added upper extensions to his harmonic understanding. So instead of just chords that are built up to the seventh, the root, third, fifth, and seventh, he adds ninths, 11ths, and 13ths. And you should think about what that means for the expansion of harmony. Obviously, a ninth is the same as the second above the root. So if you're on a C7 chord, this is a D. What you should try to do is play it at the piano and then try to add each of those notes and see what that sound gives, and then listen for how he approaches it. He combines the rich melody of Oliver with the flourishes and virtuosity typical of a clarinet. He's credited with having invented scat singing. There's an old legend about him doing a song called Heebie Jeebies, and the lyric sheet falls, and he just makes things up as he goes along. Obviously, scat singing doesn't come about in such a silly sort of way, but he does develop it over the course of his career, along with other singers as well. But he certainly is one of the people that codifies and makes it famous. He develops a highly personal approach to song interpretation, much more free approach than previous singers and players. He deepens the connection between the blues and concert styles within jazz, and he establishes the crossover appeal of black music on the white charts. As a kid, he grew up near Storyville, near Liberty and Perdido Streets, what he called the cheap Storyville. He was mostly raised by his mother and rarely saw his father, but his father was sometimes, as I mentioned previously, a grand marshal for parades, an MC for the carnival events. And Louis often followed in the second line in these parades and sometimes carried King Oliver's horn, which I've mentioned before as well. I also mentioned he sang in various vocal quartets for tips as a boy. In 1913, he was arrested for firing off a gun as a celebration, not at anybody, but just firing it into the air. But he was sent away to the Colored Waifs Home for Boys, and this is where he learned cornet. He was taken under the wing of a teacher there, and he learned cornet. And there are some wonderful pictures of him in the group as a child. When he leaves in 1917, actually, when he leaves a few years before that, when he leaves the home, he studies for a bit with Joe Oliver. Joe Oliver leaves in 1917, and Armstrong replaces him in Kid Ory's band. But then his big break is when King Oliver calls for him to join him in Chicago as part of the Creole Jazz Band. He had, as I mentioned, apprenticed to Oliver after getting out of the boys' home and considered Oliver a kind of surrogate father. Oliver treated him very well for a while. He was staying with Oliver on and off, and certainly eating dinner at his house. The lessons really were mostly free, and they were really a kind of apprenticeship. He joined Oliver's Creole Jazz Band in Chicago in 1922, and it's around this time that he gets the nickname Satchmo, which is short for satchel mouth or dipper mouth, and that's where the term dipper mouth blues comes from, because he had a rather wide mouth and expanded chops, and his cheeks blew out when he played, and so it looked like a satchel, like a piece of luggage to Oliver, and Oliver was picking on him, but it was a term of endearment, obviously. Here you can see him with his cornet, so this is before he's playing trumpet, playing cornet, standing next to King Oliver, and you can also see Lil Hardin there at the piano. You can't see the piano, but you see her seated there, and she's the arranger, of course, for the group, and the pianist for the group, and will become Louis Armstrong's first wife. In 1924, Louis Armstrong joined Fletcher Henderson's band for a brief period of time. This is out in New York, and this is one of the groups that really leads to the swing era. And Henderson often talked about this brief tenure. You can see that here you have Louis Armstrong and Coleman Hawkins in the same group, so two incredibly important early figures in jazz as jazz soloists. Coleman Hawkins, of course, being the great saxophone player. He also played clarinet. We'll talk more about Fletcher Henderson soon. This is them in 1925. Louis Armstrong doesn't stick around in the band for very long, but Fletcher Henderson and Louis Armstrong both felt that they brought something to the band and took something away. Fletcher Henderson and Louis Armstrong felt that Louis Armstrong learned a sense of form from them, that it wasn't just blues forms, but a more elaborated notion of orchestration and form and formal handling, and really attention to discipline and to a careful sense of orchestration and clarity, especially for recordings. Whereas both Fletcher Henderson and Louis Armstrong acknowledged that he brought with him a approach to soloing and an approach to rhythm, which was very new. And as we'll see, Fletcher Henderson, one of the reasons he's thought of as having a founding band within the swing era is because he's bringing this new rhythmic sensibility that he's learned from Armstrong. And of course, Armstrong had a huge impact on the way that Coleman Hawkins played. Coleman Hawkins is often regarded as one of the innovators of the approach to the saxophone, and that at first he's playing in this sort of hard late ragtime sound where it's very kind of rhythmic tonguing of the instrument so that you can hear it's a kind of approach to the instrument that's going to come back in early rock and roll. It's kind of a hard-hitting, very rhythmically precise, but somewhat old-sounding approach to the saxophone, whereas after Louis Armstrong, Coleman Hawkins begins to more evenly tongue the instrument and therefore produce this more flowing sound, this more rhythmically flexible sound. In the late 20s, Louis Armstrong recorded with his own groups, the Hot Fives and the Hot Sevens, and these are some of the landmark recordings of early jazz. They include the remarkable West End Blues of 1928, and that has Earl Hines, and we'll talk about him in a moment on that recording. That's one of the great, there's one moment that kind of slags with the trombone solo that doesn't quite work out as well as the rest of the tune. But other than that, it's one of these gems, really, of early recorded jazz, where you have the head statement, you have the piano solo, you have the singing, the sort of vocalization that Louis Armstrong does, and then of course the amazing trumpet solo on that piece. Other highlights include the stop time solo on Potato Head Blues, which anyone should know well as one of the early offerings by Louis Armstrong, and the duet with Earl Hines on piano of Weatherbird, the 3-chorus solo on Tight Like This, which is an amazing piece of work, and then the solo scatting and interaction with the guitar, which was played by the remarkable Lonnie Johnson on the song Hotter Than That. Any of these are worth listening to in great detail and really coming to know as well as you possibly can. The solo on Potato Head Blues is one that, if I have time, I will talk about in more detail with you. Earl Hines is sometimes known as developing the trumpet style of piano playing that he adapted from his work with Louis Armstrong. For the most part, pianists in early jazz are playing in the ragtime tradition. They're playing this kind of more or less contrapuntal, or at least a clear accompaniment and solo pattern. A lot of the lines are derived from ragtime vocabulary, and so the sort of limited, early blues vocabulary that's very typical of piano styles. What Earl Hines begins to do is he does a lot more single line stuff, and then works in octaves as well, as a way of reinforcing the single line. Because remember, in the 20s, the piano still isn't recording as well as it will in the 30s and the 40s. As far as the technology is concerned. And so he really wants his lines to stand out. He develops the same kind of emphasis on ninths and 11ths and 13ths that Armstrong is developing. And so he's really expanding the vocabulary of the piano, but also just the tone of the piano as a solo instrument. That it's no longer, usually, even in early Ellington recordings, you can hear that the piano solo tends to be literally that. It's a piano solo, accompanied solo, that's just sort of stuck in the middle of these recordings. It often feels forced. It often feels like an aside. Sometimes the rhythmic shape changes altogether. The band kind of more or less drops out. It doesn't work as well as it might. And as much as I deeply admire Ellington, I have to say that's true of his early piano solos on the recordings from the 20s and even some of the very early 30s. Earl Hines really discovers a way to get around that, where the band's still playing, the band is accompanying, and he's doing very little of his own accompanying in some of these solos, and he's focusing more on the right hand and the solo elements of the right hand. In 1932, Armstrong's featured in a film called Rhapsody in Black and Blue, and here you can see 2 stills from it. This video is part of your lecture materials for today. You should watch it in full on YouTube. You'll see that the way that the movie works is this black man is supposed to be doing some housework. His wife comes out and scolds him, but he would rather listen to the latest recording by Louis Armstrong, which was his hit recording, Shine. His wife bops him over the head, and he has this dream of Louis Armstrong in jazz heaven. And Louis Armstrong is, as you can see, playing the trumpet there, not the cornet, the trumpet, accompanied by a band. He's dressed in this sort of leopard skin. And you might think that this is simple exploitation. And indeed, that's what it looks like. It looks like it's an exploitation of the minstrel character, a kind of a Jim Crow character of this lazy, shiftless black man who doesn't want to do work. And then he becomes, in his dream, the king of jazz heaven. And the only thing, of course, he wants to do is listen to Louis Armstrong play. And Louis Armstrong is playing dressed up in this ridiculous manner. And yet, when you watch the film, pay attention to the way the film really emphasizes the work that Louis Armstrong's doing. It shows him sweating. It shows him making an effort. It doesn't pretend that this is music that just comes naturally. Look at, for instance, the steel guitar player's visage, his face, as he watches Louis Armstrong. He's mesmerized by what Louis Armstrong's doing. He's impressed with what Louis Armstrong's doing. He can't turn his gaze away from Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong is closing his eyes in concentration, and when the camera zooms in, you see the sweat, you see the effort that he's making. This is an important film in a number of ways. There are several jazz films from the late 20s and early 30s that make this transition away from this notion of black people just being inherently naturally musical, as it being part of their sort of connection to nature. And really we start to see jazz as a form of effort, as a form of work that some gifted black people are doing in order to make this difficult music. And this musical film, for all of its sort of questionable moments, is part of that effort, part of revealing jazz as effort. A very important turn in Louis Armstrong's career is when he meets Joe Glaser. Louis Armstrong says that he had been given advice by Joe Oliver a long time ago that he should get a white manager, right? A white business manager. Because then he's going to be taken more seriously by theater managers and theater owners. And indeed, that's exactly what he does. He meets Joe Glaser. Joe Glaser's an interesting guy. He has mob connections. He is friends with Oni Madden and several other mobsters, Dutch Schultz and Al Capone. Joe Glaser is, for a while, he runs a nightclub, and it gets shut down. And so then he begins managing boxing fights, managing boxers. And he's particularly good at fixing those fights. Right? We're not talking about a guy who's necessarily fully on the up and up, but a lot of entertainment in the 1920s and 1930s was hardly fully on the up and up. So he's taken advantage of his various connections. He was supposedly one of the more reliable fixers of fights. And so if you laid a bet with him, according to his directions, then it would turn out well, apparently. And so it was perhaps a wise business decision, at least at first, for Louis Armstrong to go with Joe Glaser, and he clearly was friends with and trusted Joe Glaser. They develop, as we'll see, their own management company, and Joe Glaser fought very hard for Louis Armstrong. He did not allow, as was often the case, for Louis Armstrong to be put in some kind of broom closet instead of a dressing room, very often with black entertainers, just as a sign of disrespect, especially in the South. Instead of giving them the unoccupied dressing room that they, of course, should have expected to use, they would be put in a broom closet or some lesser accommodation, just so that the dressing room wasn't being used by a black person, because it would usually be used by white entertainers. And Joe Glaser saw that as being stupid and ridiculous, and he wouldn't stand for it. So he made sure that Louis Armstrong got the best accommodations that were available to him. So he was a somewhat pugnacious fellow, right? Remember, he's a representative of boxers, and he took on some of that character when he was fighting on behalf of Louis Armstrong. You'll see that we're almost done here with this slideshow, and that's because I want you to spend some real time listening to as much Louis Armstrong as possible, and that should be considered part of the lecture material for today's class. Let's take a look at the last slide. By the 1930s, Louis Armstrong, under the direction of Joe Glaser, is fronting his own big band, and his recordings and film appearances make him the best-known black musician in the world at this point. He's working with the manager, Joe Glaser, as we mentioned. They start their own management company. And this is where Joe Glazer does let Armstrong down. While they're together, they're partners in the company, and Armstrong always assumed that he would become the leading partner upon Joe Glazer's death, that he would inherit basically the entirety of the management company. But instead, Joe Glazer gave it to someone else in his will. There's a lot of speculation as to why that might have been, that it might have been paying back some kind of mob debt. Whatever it was, he never explained it to Louis Armstrong, and this always left a bitter taste in Louis Armstrong's mouth, obviously, because he considered Joe Glazer not just his manager, but a close friend, and really felt that Joe Glazer had his best interests at heart, and he seemed to, as long as he was alive. So whatever happened, I guess maybe we'll never know. Between 1922 and 1939, Louis Armstrong had 55 singles in the top 20. All of Me was a bestseller for 2 weeks in 1932. And Louis Armstrong really becomes this sort of model for what jazz is, so much so that the U.S. government during the Cold War will send Louis Armstrong out as an ambassador to various countries like Brazil. But they were very concerned that Brazil was going to fall to communism, that it was becoming a communist country. And so Louis Armstrong was sent. He didn't realize he was being sent by the CIA. He thought he was just being sent by government funds, and indeed he was. But it was a front for the CIA in order to try to influence the Brazilians with an interest in what they thought was a representative of American freedom. And that's what jazz had come to represent by the 1940s and 50s. It had become a bastion of American freedom, and a lot of that had to do with Louis Armstrong. Now, again, some of this is hypocritical, of course, right? I mean, Louis Armstrong, while he was treated very well in a lot of ways, he's still treated like a black American, which means that he's still treated with a great deal of disrespect, a great deal of inequity and inequality. Still, he's one of the most respected musicians of the 1930s and early 40s among white America as well. Bing Crosby appears in several films with him and learns a lot of his approach to singing from Louis Armstrong. And Louis Armstrong says that he took certain elements from Bing Crosby, so there was a real mutual respect and mutual collaboration. This, of course, makes Louis Armstrong a bit of a target for bebop, which arises in the 40s, and the new generation of jazz musicians who feel they're taking jazz in a more exciting and more authentically black direction. And so Louis Armstrong comes under a great deal of criticism from those figures. But that's not really popular music anymore. Bebop is moving beyond popular music, and so it's not something we'll discuss as closely in this class.